All right, so this is Forum for Sunday, October 25th. Dr. Bob Amyot has agreed to lead a forum here at First Presbyterian Church in Hastings, Nebraska. And we've set up kind of this forum and next week's forum are both sort of taking a look at sort of the intersection of faith and politics. I don't know if you are aware, there's an election coming up in a couple of weeks' time. Yeah, so either mail in your ballot if you haven't already, or figure out how to vote safely in person. And so we wanted to do a couple of forums. We didn't really want to dive in too deeply to the issues of the day per se. We might talk about them anyway, just because why not, right? So Dr. Amyot has agreed to lead this forum, taking a look at polarization and maybe a little bit of how we got to this point. He'll say more about that as we go along. And then next week for forum, Dr. Catherine Biba, also of Hastings College, is going to lead a forum on William Jennings Bryan, who Nebraskans may be familiar with, and non-Nebraskans also. So with that said, I'm going to let in someone who may or may not be Bob Netterman, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Amyot.
All right. Well, thank you. I got to say, I'm very nervous because went in thinking that I would try to be an expert, but of course I've got experts sitting here listening to me. So I'm hoping perhaps we'll go have more of a conversation. But my topic today is religion and partisan polarization. And I was curious to explore why partisan polarization seems to have become so entwined with religion. And so just to start with by defining my terms here, partisan polarization means that we're actually polarizing along party lines and moving towards the polls and away from the other party. And polarization occurs when we move from just having opposing positions on issues to actually having opposing values and perhaps even getting to the point where we actually actively dislike each other or think that the other party is actually un-American or treasonous or a threat to the country. And so religion, it turns out, actually has become a pretty key part of that polarization, which has actually been taking place. Excuse me. We used to have 4 regional parties. And so, of course, the Democrats in the South, white Democrats, were conservative, especially on civil rights issues, but also on other social issues. We used to have liberal Republicans, mainly in the Northeast and perhaps out in California. We had conservative Republicans, and we had liberal Democrats. And those 4 parties gradually went away, and we moved to the system we have now, which is a 2-party nationalized system, which also happens to be aligned along ideological terms as well. So that Republicans are conservative, also liberals are, and Democrats are liberals also. But it certainly didn't used to be that way. And as we think about how that happened, I think we'll see that religion became an important part of that. I just realized I'm not sharing, so I'm going to see if I can do that. Oh, shoot. Okay. I'll just keep talking then.
Is it not letting you, Bob?
Well, I'm not as familiar with Zoom as I would like to be, so I'm gonna, well, no, I have this tiny screen, and the tiny screen doesn't seem to have a share. Found it. Okay. All right. There we go. Everybody can see that? Okay. So I would say that the parties really began to polarize in 1964. And that was when the Civil Rights Act was passed, and the Democratic Party started to win over Black voters and liberal white voters, and lose more conservative voters, especially in the South. The Republicans began by trying to attract the Dixiecrats with their states' rights positions. Later on, Richard Nixon, with his new federalism, also was meant to bring in Southerners, because it was also a sort of a states' rights version of a national policy. Plus, it attracted some libertarians. And then Reagan is really where we see the big jump. Democrats leaving the party because they really resonate with Reagan. He's bringing a focus much more on social and religious conservatism, and coupled along with that is what we call today probably the culture war. Here's why I get really nervous, and Dan, please correct me if I misstate something here. But the evangelicals were involved with politics right up until the Scopes monkey trial in 1925. And even though, of course, Scopes lost and had to pay a fine for trying to teach evolution, the amount of ridicule that was heaped on religious people after that drove a lot of folks out of politics. And so after that period, we see a lot of entrenchment among especially the evangelicals, who form their own churches, their own schools, camps, universities, and other organizations, and a general withdrawal from politics. And that continues largely into the 70s. Now, normally we think of Roe v. Wade and abortion as being the animating force behind getting evangelicals back into politics. But turns out that's not really the case, not initially. Initially, the big issue is a case called Green v. Connolly, in which a federal court decided that because certain schools and universities would deny admittance to non-whites, therefore they were not entitled to federal tax protection. And Bob Jones University is probably the biggest one. They, by 1976, had lost all the battles, and finally had to pay a fine and lose their tax protected status. And so at that point, the evangelical leaders are pretty upset. Here's government muscling in on their turf, taking away their tax protections, threatening their ability to live the gospel as they understood it. Interestingly, also in 1976 is when we see the Catholic bishops starting to take a real interest in politics as well. And voter guides start appearing. Catholic organizations are producing voter guides, letting their parishioners know who is pro-life and who isn't. To be fair, they're also talking about a lot of other issues, but 1976 is the first year where they actually encourage Catholics to take an interest in politics, and specifically are talking about the abortion issue. Because of course in 1974, or 1973 is Roe v. Wade. And so abortions now are legal throughout the country, and they're actually starting to increase in numbers. So I thought since we're talking about Catholics, take a quick peek at what happens here with Catholics. The bottom of this scale, if you can see it, is 1972, and it goes up to 2018. This data is from the General Social Survey, which is why it's a lot of sawtooth here. It's not a nice smooth thing, but I went ahead and ran the data because I really wanted to see, at least in this survey, what percentage of Republicans were Catholic. And as you can see, it's a pretty steadily increasing rate between 1972 and about 1989, when it levels off. Whereas white Democrats who are Catholic, a pretty clear, steady decline. This is kind of rather shocking because a good number of Democrats were Irish and Polish and German immigrants who were Catholic, and it was pretty well established with their religion, their ethnicity, and their party. But we see, especially after the Reagan years, a pretty steady departure from the Democratic Party here. In 1978, abortion really gets onto the national stage. In Minnesota and in Iowa, pro-life Republicans are swept into office to the shock and amazement of the pundits who didn't think, A, that it was an important issue, or B, that Republicans could win those races. And so at that point, the evangelical leaders realized that perhaps abortion could be a key issue for uniting evangelicals and getting them back involved with politics. And so they, even though one of their own is in the White House at the time, Jimmy Carter, who was himself an evangelical, they decide that they're going to back Ronald Reagan and use abortion as the issue. That they tried other things, pornography, for example. It just didn't have the same grab on people, but combined with the data that showed that more and more women were having abortions, especially white women, that really seemed to generate a lot of interest, and it also allowed building up an alliance with the Catholics, something that the evangelicals were not terribly excited about at first, but the idea of building up their political power certainly was attractive. So they go ahead and back Ronald Reagan and start to push abortion as a political issue. And that alliance between the Republican Party and the evangelicals really continues throughout the 90s and the 2000s. And we see more and more religious whites drawn to the Republican Party, until by 2012, of course, it used to be that the Republican Party was more the party of the rich, or the upper middle class. But by 2012, the household income is no longer a good predictor of whether someone's going to be a Republican or not. Instead, what matters is how often they go to church. And it doesn't matter that much which church, but certainly among white Christians, they're really drawn to the Democratic Party, sorry, the Republican Party. Meanwhile, at the same time, we see the Democrats, at least white Democrats, becoming increasingly less religious. And we see the growth of what's called the nuns, not the N-U-N-S, but the N-O-N-E-S, those who have no religious affiliation. And they are increasingly going over to the Democratic Party. So if we look at the data, again, GSS data, where we look at people's church attendance, I broke them into basically those who attend more than once a month and those who attend less than once a month. And so for Republicans, just about 50%, gradually increasing to about 50% of Republicans attend more than once a month. And you can see that change over time. The more remarkable is among white Democrats, as we see this decline from 45% down to about 30%. Black Democrats, of course, have their own dynamic. Black Democrats tend to be quite religious and don't, you know, the secularization of the Democratic Party doesn't seem to really have an effect with them. If anything, their numbers go up a little bit. So where do we stand today? We stand with lots of conflict. When we ask folks what they think whether their own beliefs are contrary to where the nation is, the two largest groups to say that they're in conflict are evangelicals and atheists and Jews. Those three groups tend to be quite high in saying that there's a lot of conflict there, which is a little puzzling. I think probably the biggest takeaway here is just that they have that perception that it's them against, you know, the country. And here are the numbers. Clearly, the white evangelicals feel the most conflict. They say 66%, 2/3 of white evangelicals say there is a great deal or some conflict between their religious beliefs and mainstream American culture, whereas 57% of atheists and 52% of Jews say that. Everybody else is much lower, much below 50%. One of the things that I was looking forward to talking about was the wonderful statistics about people preferring to have their children date someone of a different race or perhaps of a different religion than of a different party. Turns out that those numbers are hard to find and hard to replicate over years. So, but I did find an interesting study that looked at dating. A lot of folks will talk about marriage and how people tend to marry people of a similar party. But this study actually looked at online dating and tried to figure out how important party was in terms of whether a couple actually, you know, got together for more than one date. It turned out that politics was about as important as having the same level of education. So perhaps Damon will feel much better about this, but it turned out religion was much more important. Having the same religion was much more important in this study than having the same political party. So not what I expected to find, and perhaps that's comforting. I was expecting to talk about people changing their religions to match their politics, which I think still happens, but it's just the evidence for it is hard to find. More anecdotal, I guess, than anything. What we do have a lot of data on is feelings about religious government entwinement. And what's interesting is that religious Protestants of all races tend to favor more church involvement in political matters, which is, an about face from 100 years ago when they were quite eager to step away and didn't want that. In fact, when we look at, well, perhaps this is interesting, about 2/3 of all Americans think that religion should stay out of politics. Republicans, it's closer to 50%. And then white evangelicals are a majority think that the government should be actively involved with religion. And we can delve into some specifics here. So we can see that churches and other houses of worship should keep out of political matters. How many people agreed with that statement? Out of all adults, 63% of Americans agreed with that statement. But we see that the smallest groups were evangelicals and blacks, or people who attend historically black religion denominations at 43%, so 20% lower than the overall numbers. And then when we ask if churches and other houses of worship should express their views on day-to-day social and political questions, again, those very same groups, over 50% in both groups agree that that's a good thing, that churches should be involved. The ones who feel strongly against that, mainline Protestants, and then Jews and Catholics are right up there with the general adult population. The especially high ones, though, are those who are unaffiliated, the nuns, the atheists, the agnostics, who, not surprisingly, don't want churches involved at all. If we ask specifically about should the Bible have a great deal or some influence on US laws, white evangelicals, almost 90% of them want to see the Bible involved. Black Protestants aren't that far behind at 76%. And we see this, if we look at this by party, 2/3 of Republicans want the Bible to have some influence on US laws. So by 2020, the white evangelical Christians have become a key part of the Republican electorate. Certainly, 3/4 of them identify with the GOP. And the interesting thing about that, though, is that this is actually a smaller and smaller part of the general electorate. The total share of voters who are white Christians has fallen to about 40%, and white nuns are about 25%. So the Republicans have narrowed who they're drawing from to pretty much white Christians, especially white evangelicals, and that group is actually falling in size. They're getting more and more of the people in that group, but as a whole, that group is falling. And we can see it in this chart. We compare 2009 to 2019, and we can see that the white Christians are increasingly going more and more, becoming more and more Republican. And that's especially true for white evangelicals. When we look at young people, only about 1/4 of today's young adults are white Christians. So for the Republican Party, it looks like they are going to have to look somewhere else soon, not right away, but soon, rather than keep depending on this one segment of the population for support. So that's, I've got some more charts, but I wanted to pause there and ask if y'all had any questions or comments. Dan, did I say something wrong here?
Yeah, I'm not the statesman, Bob. No, I was rather surprised that, after the Scopes monkey trial, I guess I never did realize, but it's true that evangelicals tried to pull themselves out of politics. That's very interesting. Of course, I only started living about the time that they started getting back in. So, but the question I have, and I don't know if it's relevant here or not, but someone sent me yesterday a statistic on the number of early voting ballots that they have. And apparently people between the ages of 18 and 25 have on average increased their early voting by about 4 or 5 times. So maybe last year in Washington State, there were 50,000 between the ages of 18 and 25, and now there are 250,000. So the other thing to take into consideration here is age. And I just wonder how many of those white evangelical Protestants, where does their age group fit in? My guess is that they're losing people in those early age groups, 18 to 25.
Yeah, I think so. But it's interesting because I've come across 2 different statistics or thoughts on lines of thought on this. One is that it's good news for the Democrats that so many young people are voting, because 2/3 of the young voters are voting Democrat. On the other hand, some survey data shows us that actually young people are starting to turn back to conservatism, and also that young people are tending to adopt their parents' partisan leanings more than they used to. For those of us who remember or grew up in the 60s, of course, rebellion against your parents was sort of a de rigueur, right? But today, it's amazing the amount of congruence between parent and child, adult child, is almost as high as it is between married people. It's something like 75%. So I'm wondering if all of these young people, who are growing up with Fox News or MSNBC in their homes, are just simply going to follow suit and follow their parents. So I'm not sure that. I'm not sure. I'm hearing data from both sides.
I blame that on the minivan, frankly. Spending every hour of your day with your parents in a caravan vehicle.
The biggest thing, though, and there is no doubt about this, is the percentage of our population that is white is steadily decreasing, right? Where because of immigration and because of higher birth rates among non-whites, just simply demographically, more and more non-whites are entering the young adults, and they are overwhelmingly voting Democrat, and that's something that the Republicans are not doing a great job right now with reaching out to those folks.
Bob, I think that Will had a question. I want to give him a chance to get in.
How many of you remember the name Jerry Whalen? Any of you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Now, somehow I was on a committee with Jerry in about 1970, and the Whalen energy plant is named after Jerry. Now, he was very smart and a very good speaker, and he was lieutenant governor. He was Saint Cecilia's Roman Catholic, and I remember him talking a lot about how solidly democratic the Catholics were. He even talked about the area north and south and east and west of St. Cecilia's was the Catholic Democratic ghetto.
Yep.
Now, so Bob, it's a compliment to you. Your charts help me understand better what I think we all know has been happening, which is the movement of Roman Catholics from Democrat to Republican. I mean, the data shows that. And that maybe one of the major reasons is the abortion issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's fascinating. Kathy and I were Catholic up until just maybe 10 years ago. And so we were a part of that and watched many of our friends be first politicized by the abortion issue and then adopt many of the other Republican issues and afterwards. So I think that it's an interesting dynamic to think about in terms of you may be brought into the fold along one issue, but then you seek congruence after that and start to adopt the other positions that you may not have been open to earlier. And it's not something that just happens to Republicans or conservatives. It happens on both sides, where people will take their cues from their peers, from the people who they want to be accepted by, or are spending a lot of time with, and learn from them and learn what the correct issue positions are on gun control, taxation, whatever. And so, we have good friends who are staunch Catholics still, who now are quite happy to talk about, Joe Biden's sons and their peccadillos and their laptops, and they're willing to. They've totally embraced, the entire partisan package. So it's I think it's interesting that so many Catholics have switched over and are so close to the Republican Party. Again, white.
This is Neil Hoff.
Yes.
Hi, could you talk about how the educators are divided between Republicans and Democrats and their influence, as well as the influence that you've been talking about the religious influence?
Educators. Don't have a whole lot of data on that. Of course, we know that teachers' unions tend to be, pro-Democrat because of the labor union part of that. And we also know that university professors tend to be liberal because generally, though, that the thought is that the more educated you become, the more liberal you become. And so those are, it's hard to see how those are. That's not to say that there aren't obviously, conservative teachers and conservative college professors, but both of those groups, at least when they're acting out in the open, they seem to be more democratically oriented. Is that what you're thinking of, Neil?
Well, you mentioned that you tend to be what your parents are because of the minivan. You were in the minivan. Well, do you tend to be what your teachers are because you're in school so many years?
I don't think so. I think, just talking from personal experience, my students tend to be very much followers of either their parents or their friends. at least at the college level, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of students who are eager to follow their professors. Maybe Dan probably had a different experience than I did. But, my students tend to be pretty darn independent and eager to take on me or each other. Or unfortunately, the other thing that I see a lot of, especially with my more conservative students, is that they just assume that I and the other students are liberals, and they just shut down. They don't want to talk about it, and they'll just be quiet. And and I try to provoke them and get them to talk about their feelings or their beliefs or to ask their questions, and they every now and then I succeed, but most of the time they just sit back and are quiet, and that actually concerns me. I'd rather have, I think a lot of our students at Hastings College are conservative, or certainly they're coming from conservative homes, and that's their initial orientation. And I think many of them are nervous about talking about politics, and I'm constantly looking for ways to try to get them to open up and actually go ahead and challenge professors. Unfortunately, of course, they're coming from places where generally they don't want to challenge authority. They've been trained not to do that. So that's I see that as the bigger problem right there.
Thank you.
And Bob, I also wonder if the reason they don't want to talk about politics is because the models of talking about politics we have these days, involves a lot of vitriol and a lot of, yelling across the aisle and things like that. They feel like they might be, getting into some sort of rather aggressive conversation. We don't model good civic discussions about politics as well as we should, or at least our media tend not to do that.
Yeah, I would agree. And the general, the general assumption that we all have our own sets of facts, that there aren't any objective facts that we can all agree on, really makes it difficult for us to have conversations. It used to be that I would assign people to look at an issue, marshal the facts, bring them and maybe have a debate in class or something like that. I'm not sure that's actually the most constructive way to do that anymore. Rationality no longer is seen as, is accepted as the be all and end all of logical or of discourse. Logic is not necessarily the best way to carry out discourse. At this point, I'm actually leaning more and more towards trying to do projects together where liberals and conservatives have to work together to solve a problem and become aware that their partners may not have the same political leaning that they do, but that they actually can come to some conclusions about what the problem is and how to solve it. So in a way, I'm sidestepping a lot of the ideology and a lot of the politics, and instead trying to get them to just simply work together and realize that maybe that LGBTQ person or that Republican religious person is not the boogie man or boogie woman that their media sources are telling them they are, and instead they can actually work together.
Bob, I'm curious about what, and maybe, I don't know if you have any idea or not, what percentage of the general US population claims an affiliation with either Republican or Democrat parties? Does that make sense?
when we ask people if they're if they're Democrats or Republicans, or what party they ascribe to, most of them say that they're independents. But then when we say, well, yeah, okay, you're an independent, but which party do you lean towards? When we push them a little bit, most of them will choose a side. So political scientists today will actually instead lump the leaners in with the declared partisan members, for a good reason. Turns out that if you say that you lean towards the Republican Party or lean towards the Democratic Party, you're actually more engaged and more likely to adopt the party stances than if you say, yeah, I'm a weak Republican or I'm a weak Democrat. So it's this odd, there's something about calling yourself an independent or saying that you're not a party, chill, that seems very American. But if we can get you to tell us which side you lean towards, yeah, we know pretty well where you stand on things. So I would actually say that probably 2/3, if we count the leaners, at least 2/3 choose a side, and probably it's more like 3/4.
Does that same sort of phenomenon carry over for religious identity as well? Or I guess someone said, well, I'm a weak Presbyterian, right?
Yeah.
Or if someone says, well, I lean Presbyterian, or I lean evangelical, or.
Yeah, I have not seen I don't think anybody's asked it quite that way.
Oh,
I would, in fact, it used to be all about what is your religion, what is your denomination, but there are so many, of course, denominations now. It's far more helpful to know how often do you go to church. And that tells us so much more about, or helps us really predict how you're going to vote or what your feelings are on a lot of different things. Just simply how often do you go to church? I mean, unless you're a member of a very specific religion, like the Jewish religion. So I think what I find is really striking is the number of students, even at Hastings College, who come to school having no religious background at all. And I have to, if I'm going to make any sort of religious allusion or talk about, evangelicals or fundamentalists, as opposed to, the Black church, for example, there's no background there. I have to actually explain it all. And I find that really, really interesting. I really hope that we go back to having some sort of at least religious literacy or something, so that our students get some background in the Bible and in our religious history. So I think there are a lot of folks out there who are basically blank slates in terms of religion, and could be evangelized, could be educated, brought in by any of the churches. The big thing that holds a lot of them back, though, is that they see religion as being about conflict, about being about judgment, about that sort of thing, and they just don't want any part of it. So
I have a question. If I may, I have a question. Some of your data showed the tendency of evangelicals to want their faith to be informing the government. But I was wondering if you had any data on the reverse, because what I see is this rise of Christian nationalism, in which the two almost become one. That politics and religion almost go hand in hand, and I think that's what I see a lot of right now in the Republican Party. The claims that are being made about Donald Trump being a prophet that has been foretold in Isaiah 45 and things like this. So I don't know if you have any insight on that or any just opinion.
Yeah, well, I think you're right on. Christian nationalism is definitely rising, especially if we identify it with what it really is, white Christian nationalism, and that it is. Yeah, I think this confluence of looking for any way to justify the political connection with the religious connection is there, and so turning to biblical texts or turning to the founders and making the argument that, well, the founders were actually Christian, and therefore and fundamentalists. I love that one. They were fundamentalist Christians and founded the country in that in that vein, which is not true, but that argument seems to really get a lot of resonance amongst a lot of Republicans today. And so that's, I think it's normal, it's natural. We look for ways to buttress our positions. But I think the danger of that white Christian nationalism taking over the Republican Party is that, well, in the long term, there aren't going to be that many white Christian nationalists out there, and that party will end up being eclipsed by something else. And not sure what that is. It makes sense for the Hispanic or for the Latino community to move into the Republican Party. Family oriented, very religious, very entrepreneurial. And so that would seem to be a natural fit if the Republicans could change their stance on immigration. But that they seem to be unable to do that, probably because of the white nationalism part of it. But not sure what's going on there. But change is a coming for the Republicans, and I'm not sure where it's going to come from.
Can I ask another historical question?
Uh-oh.
Didn't there used to be like a bull moose party? And when
Yes.
did we end up with, I know you talked about having sort of 4 regional parties.
Right.
Like when did we come to have 2 parties?
We've always had 2 parties. George Washington had ended up with 2 parties in his cabinet. As anybody who watches, who enjoys listening to Hamilton will hear that rap battle actually did, okay, they didn't rap, but there really was a fight between the Federalists, Hamilton's side, and the Jeffersonians. And ever since then, we've largely had 2 parties. There was a brief period where we only had 1 party in the early 1800s, but for the most part, we have always had 2 parties. The Bull Moose Party was the one time when a third party did really well in an election, and that was when Teddy Roosevelt, who was incredibly popular, came back from his safari doing his safaris in Africa, realized that the Republican Party had abandoned his progressivism that he had worked so hard to try to inculcate into the party, and decided to take on a sitting president. And so he ended up splitting the Republican Party. And so his progressive or Bull Moose Party nominated him. He ran against Taft, split the Republican vote, allowing Wilson to win. So third parties tend to be really successful. They're not really successful. More successful when they have a personality, like Teddy Roosevelt or Ross Perot actually heading them. So perhaps Donald Trump, if he were to be defeated this term and decided he wanted to get back into politics and ran again in 2024, and the Republicans declined to nominate him, and he ran ahead and ran as his own, as the American Party or something like that, we could see that dynamic again. Slight chance that the Republican Party would shatter, and Republicans would either join the American Party or join the Democratic Party. But or it would be a flash in the pan. The American Party would exist for one term, one election, and then when Trump retires, then it would just go away. So yeah, there's something about the American psyche that seems to be generally attracted to only having two choices, and also, of course, our electoral system, where the winner takes all, and so that also encourages just two parties.
I'm going to start to draw us to a close. Maybe one last question, perhaps, if there's one out there. I'm going to give a nice lengthy pause. Like Dan's cat has lengthy pauses. Okay, so then I'm going to go ahead and draw us to a close. My thanks to Dr. Amyot for joining us this morning. Next week, same time, same link. Dr. Catherine Biba, also from Hastings College, is going to lead a forum on William Jennings Bryan. So if you're curious about the intersection of faith and politics, specifically looking at the life and times of William Jennings Bryan, that should be very interesting. Dr. Biba always does a very nice job with those sorts of things. So my thanks again to Bob, Dr. Amyot, my apologies. I would like to close us with a word of prayer, if that is okay. Loving and gracious God, I thank you for your word, which comes to us and calls us to be curious, and curious about the lives of others. Your word comes to us and calls us to act in ways that are loving, to love our neighbor as we love ourselves, to love you with the entirety of our being. Help us, oh God, to be faithful to your word. Help us to always keep those commandments in mind. The commandments which your son, Jesus, said are the greatest, to love you with our whole being and to love our neighbor as yourself. Help us to continue to be curious, continue to be open to the deep questions of life. In your gracious and loving name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Bob. Very interesting.
All right.
Yes, thank you,
For-
Bob.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Great
Bob.
seeing you.
It was great.
Thank you all.
Enjoy New York.
Have a lovely day. Tune in
You
for
too.
worship. It's about to start.
Okay, Bob. We're good.
How about